Hi Sarah, here's the introduction to the IC Sweet Spot, which, just to remind you, is this new systemic way of enabling you and your team to get all the resources you could ever want and need to do the job the way you want to do it forever. So, no biggie then. And as this is just the introduction, I'll walk you through a quick review of where you're at currently, particularly some of the long-standing challenges you and your team may well be facing. Then we'll look at a fresh perspective on old issues which you may find useful, and then we'll start mapping out a systemic approach that can help you reach the sweet spot, which is, well, I guess my overall goal for you. And because I'm not able to present this to you live, please pause it at any point and jot down any questions you'd like to ask me afterwards. So let's start by thinking about where you and maybe at least some of your team may be currently, because I found that internal communication specialists, well, probably everybody really, but of course I'm interested in IC specialists, seem to have an almost perpetual monologue going round and round in their heads, which always seems to start with the phrase, if only I had more time or more budget, or maybe more confidence in myself or some of the people I have to work with, or more influence with certain key people around the place. Now, I don't know if you recognize any of these yourself, or if you think some members of your team would be likely to do so, but it is kind of inevitable that it leads to the question, well, what could your life be like if you didn't have to yearn for these anymore, if they could actually be for real, and not just for the short term, but for the rest of your career? Now, of course, I would understand anyone being skeptical about this, but maybe we have some valid reasons to be optimistic. And I guess you may already be onto the fact that this is partly what's behind the BSI project, but even that project is only going to be part of the sweet spot story. And I say this because that perpetual monologue is usually being driven by a bunch of common issues which may not be entirely in your control. These are just a few examples, and obviously you and your team may have other challenges of your own, but you may recognize some of these. It's actually a duplicate of the list I emailed you, so you might want to have that list handy so you can refer to it as we go through this presentation. And if you want to, you could pause this video and spend a few moments seeing how many of them you can identify with. And it might be interesting at some point to find out which ones your team members would tick off too. And while you're thinking about it, what other issues would you or they add to this list? And if you think about the issues you recognize, it might also be useful to consider this question. Just how long have these issues been part of your life? Were they not there at the beginning of last year, or even the year before that? In fact, you may recognize the list from when you and I first worked together, because I actually wrote it in 1996. So it's clear that these issues seem always to have been with us. And I think that's really significant because it tells us three really important things. Firstly, that we have simply inherited these issues from the people who came before us, who no doubt inherited them from their predecessors and so on. And the reason that matters is because it tells us that there isn't really anyone to blame for these issues. So even though they may be a real pain, they're not really anybody's fault as such. However, it also tells us that these issues are not simply going to go away on their own just because we don't like them. So what if we were to take a moment to stop and think about the fact that, given they've been around forever, well, just who is benefiting from these issues? Are you and your team? Or do they not sap your resources and add frustration and even stress into some of your days? And how about the people you're working for? I mean, one or two of these issues may seem to benefit them in the short term, but longer term, surely they're losing out too. And what about the impact this paradigm could be having on the people who need to receive the communications? Or Novartis as a whole? Surely this paradigm can only be a drag on its operating costs, reputation, and market position. So it seems that whichever of these and other issues you recognize, you and the people you work with have actually inherited a lose-lose-lose-lose situation. And as I said, it's not really anybody's fault as such, but it does raise a couple of questions. Firstly, given that there seem to be no real winners from this paradigm, we could ask ourselves, in that case, why on earth do we put up with it? But of course, would the answers to that question really help us that much, or might we be better off asking something else? What can we do to create something healthier for all of us, where everybody wins? Wouldn't that be cool? But is it really possible, or just a pipe dream? Well, to find out, maybe we need to turn to heads wiser than our own. Someone like, well, this bloke, for example, who once famously observed that no problem can be solved at the level of consciousness that created it. Now, of course, the term consciousness is bandied about by loads of people and seems to have so many different meanings that I feel it would be useful to specify just what Einstein was getting at here. And for me, it seems logical to suggest that what he was actually talking about was perception or perspective, that we need a higher perspective in order to sort this out. Maybe that's what we need to do. Take a more systemic approach to all of our inherited challenges. However, even though it would undoubtedly make sense to change a paradigm in which everybody is currently losing, at least to some extent, chances are many people are almost certainly going to want the change to be easy for them to make. We're probably also going to have to be able to show that we can get there relatively quickly with as little time investment as possible, and the issue of cost is bound to come up, so we'll need those changes not just to be cheap, but if possible even demonstrate how they could be profitable for Novartis. And that's exactly what we can show, that the necessary investment could be massively outstripped by the returns it could deliver. And importantly, you can know this before you even start. However, because changing any current way of doing things can sometimes threaten people's comfort zones and possibly the odd ego or two, we'd need these changes to make everybody feel better about themselves because, well, why would they? Because they'll be more empowered and the results will be making everybody's lives better. Does this make sense? Because if we can achieve this, chances are we'll be able to turn that lose-lose-lose-lose situation into a win-win-win-win. Now, of course, some people might look at this and think, well, it all sounds just too good to be true. But is it? If we take a systemic approach? Well, let's see. So just what is this systemic approach I'm advocating? Well, it requires three factors to come together in a way which supports your performance. Now, these three factors actually apply to everybody in the workplace, so you and your team already have all three of these in play at the moment. The question is, though, are all three of these demonstrably fit for purpose? Firstly, we have to consider the practices that you and your team are using, which need to have been designed in a demonstrably fit for purpose manner. And by practices, I mean things like the briefing process they follow, how things get approved and signed off, the way they seek and manage feedback, and all those other templates and procedures and tools they might be using. And again, you probably recognize this list from the BSI project brief. Importantly though, even if all the practices are designed to be demonstrably fit for purpose, they're not going to work that well unless everybody who needs to use them has the necessary skills to do so. Crucially though, even with those skills, you and your team are still not going to be able to add as much value as possible unless you also have a mandate which is going to enable everybody who needs to use those fit for purpose practices and skills. Make sense? Hope so. It's kind of frustrating not being able to get any feedback from you as we go. But anyway, if any one of these three is in any way unfit for purpose, then neither you, your team, your clients, approval group members is going to be able to perform as well as possible. And if you recognize any of these issues, we can be pretty certain that at least one of these three must be unfit for purpose, at least to some extent. So this is what we really need to address, because it's only when all three are fully fit for purpose that they can come together and create the sweet spot which will enable your team to perform as it really could. And this can bring a whole host of benefits to everybody involved, not just those inside the IC function, but people outside as well. Equally importantly though, It's only when your team is realizing its full potential that it can support Novartis to perform as well as possible. Now, of course, I'm not saying that optimum IC team performance will guarantee Novartis performance as well as it could, because there are too many other factors involved. We know that. However, we can guarantee two things. Firstly, that if you and your team are not in the sweet spot at present, they cannot be performing as well as possible. Now, as we know, that's not necessarily anybody's fault. It's just, that inherited paradigm that's affecting you, your clients, and everybody else. However, if this is the case, the second thing we can guarantee is that Novartis must be underperforming as well, because internal communication is simply so pervasive. And this means it's in everybody's interests for you to get yourself and your team into this sweet spot. This really should be a no-brainer, and it means, well, maybe we need to think about how to ensure the skills, practice designs and mandate of all your team are demonstrably fit for purpose. And this obviously means changing the current situation. So, do you have the mandate you'd need for such systemic change? And what would that mandate need to include if it's going to be sustainable long term? All clear so far? So it seems that if your mandate is going to be sustainable, it may need up to 3 components. Firstly, it's certainly going to involve a technical component. It's also likely to need a financial component, especially if your budgets are being squeezed. And thirdly, it may possibly need to include a cultural component as well. So I'll briefly explain these components for you, what they are and why you might need them, starting with the technical mandate. If we look at the list of issues you've identified, and those your team might tick off as well, you're unlikely to be able to make the kind of changes you might need to without also having to change at least some of the working practices of your clients and possibly approval group members too. And many of these people are probably quite senior, more senior at least than the IC specialists who are going to be asking for those changes. So why would any senior manager allow someone relatively junior to dictate their working practices unless they have complete faith that what's being asked of them is DFFP, demonstrably fit for purpose? And this means that getting the practice designs and execution skills right is, if you like, a kind of minimum hygiene requirement. We need this really as our sort of line in the sand, as it were. However, when it comes to the issue of developing your team's execution skills, there is an elephant in the room. And this elephant is enshrined in the phrase skills training. Many organizations use this expression in order to distinguish between, on the one hand, the teaching of techniques for doing things, and on the other, simple knowledge training about the products and services they offer. The trouble is, skills training doesn't really exist. It's kind of a myth, even though there are plenty of training companies whose literature and websites say you will learn these skills. You won't. Think about it. When you were learning to drive, by the time you got to the end of your first lesson, were you a skilled driver? Of course you weren't, because if people need to develop their skills, a single lesson is never going to be enough. We don't learn skills on a course. We can gain insights and learn techniques, but it's only through practice that we become skilled, and that takes time, which many people don't get because they're simply pitched straight back into the workplace with no more time to think and get used to new ways of working. In fact, they often have less time because they're now having to catch up on that backlog that built up whilst they were away on the training course. And when they're under pressure, many people just revert to what they're familiar with, and much of their new learning can get lost. So this tells us very clearly that if we're serious about getting into that sweet spot, then in order for your team to have the time to develop demonstrably fit for purpose skills, you may need to take on some extra pairs of hands for a short time. So already the alarm bells may be going off because, well, hang on a second, that's going to increase the size of the investment, which would be a challenge if you've already identified with number 6 on that list of issues I sent you, not having enough budget. So that's why we may also need the financial mandate to support your sweet spot, which means it's now time to look at how this systemic approach all fits together. So, before we can even think about developing the technical mandate, we may need to start by building a robust, credible business case for the changes you need to make. And we do this through a process of internal communication financial auditing, which I'll be delighted to talk you through if we can get your Skype to let me do that. Briefly though, what it does is it enables you to measure some of the unnecessary costs that are tied up in your current inherited paradigm, so you can demonstrate to your senior managers the value of changing it. That should enable you to get the budget you need for the sweet spot. Firstly, enabling you to take on any extra pairs of hands you need, whether that's short or long term, as well as funding the training any of your team might need in order to develop their technical mandate by learning demonstrably fit for purpose practice designs. And because the financial mandate should have put those extra pairs of hands in place, taking up the slack, your team, after they've learned the practice designs, can then invest some of their time tailoring and getting used to their new practices so they can become increasingly skilled in applying them, which means they can start moving into the sweet spot. Importantly though, if you want the team not just to reach the sweet spot but to stay there, there are a couple of other things we may need to consider in order to make the sweet spot sustainable. Firstly, some of that tailoring may involve the development of the cultural mandate. Now, the cultural mandate may prove to be important when we recognize that many clients are likely to be more senior than members of your team, and that the passage of time means that there will be a natural turnover of both clients and team members. So it may well be necessary to remove subjectivity, seniority and egos from questions about how IC practices need to be carried out. And we can do this by demonstrably aligning those fit-for-purpose practices to Novartis's values, because it means the question of whether a particular IC practice should be done in a particular way is no longer determined by the question of who's more senior than whom. What the cultural mandate does is enable the IC team to say, we don't do it like this because I say so, but because Novartis's values demand that we do it like this. It's not a matter of opinion, it's a matter of corporate brand policy. So this cultural mandate is giving you a sort of belt and braces approach, and it may be a step beyond what you require, but it's there if you need it. And then finally, on the sustainability front, we can always do follow-up audits to remeasure the business impact of the DFFP practices on a regular basis in order to demonstrate the value those practices are adding. So this, in a nutshell, is the systemic approach I was talking about. And of course, this whole session would have been far more effective, I'm sure, if you could have been asking me questions and making observations as we go. So, it's not ideal, but hopefully it gives you at least a sense of the beginnings of what's possible. And now that you've got access to this video, it would be great to arrange a time for a follow-up chat, because I imagine you may have all manner of questions. And of course there's loads more detail behind each of these three components, which ideally I'd like to be able to talk you through, because this is still very high level at the moment, and it would be great to be able to show you how viable it can be for you to reach that new paradigm that could look something like this. So, if you want to chat on the phone, or if you found someone who's been able to explain how to make me a presenter on the Skype system, it would be great to catch up when you've a free slot in your diary, because from what you've been saying, I'm pretty sure we can make this win-win-win-win happen for you, your team, their clients, employees, and Novartis as a whole. So remembering that we have got a kind of a finite window in which to put together your business case if you want it, give me a bell, or text me, or send me an email or whatever, and hopefully we can catch up soon.